I'm Wendy Royal, and I'm on the organising committee of the South African Film Festival. And it is my great pleasure to welcome Aviva Amour-Ostroff to talk with us today. She is the co-writer, co-director, and star of the brilliant film Lune. So welcome, Aviva.
Thank you for having me.
I have to tell you, Aviva, that I absolutely loved your film. I watched it 3 times already, and every time I find something new that I learn from it, that I get from it. It's so poignant and layered. So I'm very excited to have this conversation with you today. Let's just jump in. So Lune follows the life and struggles of expat Miriam, who has left South Africa and living in Toronto, but is still obviously very much impacted by South Africa and connected to it. In a way, this is a new direction for the South African Film Festival, because in the past, we've always focused on South Africans in South Africa, and films have been located in South Africa. So you're kind of taking us in a new direction, which is actually very exciting because most of our audience are expats across Canada. And so I really feel that this film resonates with us. So could you tell us about your own journey and that of your families from South Africa to Canada? I'm not sure if you were actually born in South Africa or with your family, but obviously you're still very much impacted by the experience of your family. So over to you.
Thank you. My father and grandparents were born and raised in Joburg. And when I was 4, my dad brought me from Montreal in Canada over to South Africa, where I lived until I was 9. And then I came back to Canada, and I have never been back since. So my influence is really from those primitive years, those fundamental years between 4 and 9, and also the influence of my father and my grandparents and my aunt, who I all lived with while I lived there.
Okay, that's interesting. And it's interesting also that you chose as a sort of pivot for your film, the 1994 elections. I actually emigrated in the late 70s, but I remember very, very clearly how passionately I felt about the elections and how much I actually wanted to go back and be there in South Africa. And it was at the time as much of a pipe dream for me as it obviously was for Miriam. So I'm sure that is just one of the things that will resonate with us expats here. So moving on to the impact that obviously your father had on this film, because the film was dedicated to and inspired by your father, who also suffered from a mental disorder, and with whom you co-wrote the screenplay. So could you tell us about your relationship with your father and what the process was like in co-writing this piece?
Thank you. My dad and I were very close, and he was a single parent, which in the 70s and 80s and even 90s was pretty rare for the male to be the primary caregiver, which he was. He would have manic episodes. In my teens, it was annually. And that's why the story takes place in that time period, because that's when I was a teenager, and that's when it was sort of the most challenging for me because I was alone with him. And he passed away almost 10 years ago, but he was a pretty prolific writer. As his job, he often was hired as a copy editor, and he worked in that sort of journalism world. And he had a lot of poetry, and he had his life story written, and lots of little notebooks and notes. And so when he passed, I had about a suitcase full of his writings, which I then took and stole from in order to make the script. The script was originally a play that I had written, and I had written it actually in grade 12, my final year in high school. and my dad had seen it. And then later in my 30s, I had taken it out again, and that's when I made the main character into a woman. So selfishly, I could play that part. And my dad saw some excerpts of that piece. And it was only after he died that I made the play into a film and used a lot more of his writing. And either from memory or from little bits and pieces that I found, I basically plagiarized him, which is why he has the co-writing credit.
Right. Wow, that's so interesting. And so basically you're playing your father in a sense, and Eliza is you as a young girl. So I think that relationship was just so real, and I'm sure you must have put so much of your own experiences into that, and we really sort of sympathize so much with Eliza and what she was going through, her love for her mother, but also how embarrassed she often got by her mother. So I'm sure that was sort of a reflection of how you often experienced your young years. Is that right?
Yeah, even my older years.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Moving on from that, then, I think what strikes you with the film is the honesty and the openness with which you deal with a mental health issue. Was that difficult for you? And what did you want the audience to take away from that?
It wasn't difficult to be honest about it. I learned very early on that being upfront and being honest allows other people to do the same. And on a more superficial level, it brings a lot of attention. I remember being in the schoolyard in South Africa and talking about my dad being my only parent and kids not really understanding because nobody had just a dad. And I remember that moment so clearly because I recognized that being upfront and honest was bringing me a lot of attention, which I guess I liked or needed. And it can be very cathartic for other people, I think. And so with the film, I hope that that is accomplished, that people can either recognize their own selves or their loved ones, and it gives them permission to speak about it, if not only just feel a little less isolated or less stigmatized or alone.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's amazing. I'm going to shift now to a little bit of a different theme, and that is like talking about race, class, privilege, and religion. In Lune, you challenge the stereotypes around that so brilliantly. In the 90s, it was a fairly prevalent assumption that if you were a white South African, you must be rich and racist. And yet you actually upended that, you exploded that by making Miriam and Eliza poor and struggling, and Michael, the black boyfriend, is rich and his parents are professional. Also, one sort of falls back on old cliches and assumes that Miriam is going to be opposed to her daughter's black boyfriend. And yet, on the contrary, she embraces him and actually sensitizes him to the challenges that Black people feel and face in Toronto and in Canada. Did you deliberately challenge these stereotypes, or was this just an evolution of the character? And how much was a reflection of your own or your father's experiences?
It was a combination of all of those things. So I was very aware that I was challenging stereotypes, and it was really to my father's credit that his rejection of the South African politics and frankly his Judaism led him to a place of freedom and poverty, I think. It was also his inability to maintain a job because of his mania, his bipolar disorder that led us to not being very wealthy. We were poor and we were still privileged. So I don't know if that makes sense, but even though there were times where we were on welfare or going to the food bank, I still went to an arts high school. I still had a lot of friends and a lot of support, and I was exposed to a lot of culture, and that in itself is a privilege. And I was loved. So baseline, I grew up quite privileged despite not having a lot of money. In high school, I did have a boyfriend that was wealthy. He was white. And I chose in the script to fictionalize him and make him Black, simply to heighten the stakes of the story and to give that character his own trajectory and his own needs and wants. And like you said, to challenge the stereotypes.
That's excellent and so true, because I think when Eliza is feeling like she is struggling, I think it was so important for Miriam to point out that even though he was rich, he was still Black and had so many challenges in his life as a Black person, even in Canada. So I think that was very important. Going on from there, during Miriam's manic phase, she has no filters, she has no social decorum. And in that phase, she exposes some very raw truisms: the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the embedded racism in Canadian society. Are there any experiences that inspired you to place these moments of cultural criticism in the film? Why did you think it was important to do that?
I think in Canada, we have a very, or at least even 3 years ago when we were making the film, we have a very disillusioned perspective of how wonderful and peaceful and diplomatic our country is. And really it's full of genocide. And we're only really coming to terms with that now, not even coming to terms with it, but at least exposing it a bit more. And so it was important to me to speak to the hypocrisy. It's easy to look at 1980s or 1990s South Africa and condemn its racism because it's so obvious and prevalent, whereas in Canada it was really hidden. And I'm not even speaking only to our Indigenous peoples here, that we're now uncovering how much genocide took place. I'm also talking about just the day-to-day racism. And it's very easy for us as Canadians to pretend that it doesn't exist, which I think is in some ways a little bit more dangerous, to hide it or deny it. And so it was important for me to call it out.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's so true. And yeah, I think I experienced that same sort of feeling when I came to Canada in the 70s, because I was very sort of anti-apartheid. And yet the longer I lived in this country, the more was revealed to me that there was a kind of quiet racism there, that people did not expose. And I also learned about residential schools very early on when I arrived, and yet it has taken so long for that to reach the general consciousness of Canadians. So it was very enlightening and very poignant for you to put that into your film. So I thank you for that. And yet, when she was on her extreme breakdown, just before breaking point, Miriam calls Michael by a very derogatory expletive. Why? Why did you put that into the film?
Because I don't think that racism and coming to terms with our own racism is simple. And for lack of a better term, it's not black and white. We all have deeply embedded prejudice and bias. And I think it's too simplistic to say that we are not racist or racism is wrong. And without it, I think that prevents us from unpacking all the complexities of it. So this person, Miriam, who grew up as a wealthy white South African and has rejected that part of herself, and she truly wants to fight for justice. I wanted to show that she still has parts of her, like she still is a rich white South African. Despite her life experience and despite her politics. I think racism and our fight to heal is quite complicated. And I think, especially as white people, we really want to fix it. And we really want to be like, no, it's fine. We're not. It's cool. We won't be racist anymore. And that can be quite dangerous because we skip a bunch of steps. We skip the hard work of examining our bias, not only white people, everybody. And so I wanted to not idolize the person that is, the political fight of anti-racism. I wanted to make it complicated.
I think that's why I found your film so brilliant. I think that's why it is so layered, because you do show so well the complexity of race relations, the complexity of mental disorders. And I think that just makes your film so poignant and so beautiful. My last question, in a way you've answered it, but I'm going to ask it anyway, because again, I don't think you can ever talk about South Africa without talking a lot about race. But I was curious to read your Indigenous land acknowledgement at the end of the movie after the credits. And it, I had to go back and stop the movie to really take that in. But I thought it was very important, and I hope many other people saw it as well. But it did say, in the 1940s, South African officials came to Canada to study the Native Act, which they used to model elements of apartheid. Many of the systems designed to erase Indigenous languages, cultures, rights, and traditions are still in practice today throughout Canada. So my question is why, and perhaps you've answered, but you could expand on it, why was it so important to link the racism of apartheid South Africa with the racist treatment of Indigenous people in Canada?
Because when we look at South Africa, from our perspective over here in Canada, we look at it and we go, it's terrible. Segregation, awful. How could they have done that? And I wanted to expose the fact that not only has Canada as a country done that to its first peoples, but actually the apartheid system was inspired by Canada, and residential schools studied. Like we did that before the apartheid regime was implemented. And it's very, very easy for us to sweep it under the rug here and place blame on places that, or deny our part in it. And as more, and again, the film we shot at the end of 2019, we edited at the beginning of 2020. So it was almost before a lot of this, definitely before the children's bodies were uncovered and before George Floyd was murdered. Like a lot of stuff has come up since we shot the movie. So I think more and more people are becoming aware of the atrocities that have occurred here on this land. But it was really important to me to draw the parallels and expose the government and our participation in the current reality is not innocent.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you. That was a wonderful answer. I think we've almost run out of time, but I do want you to be able to comment on whatever else you would like to, and also to ask you what one or two messages you'd like people to get from your film.
Okay, well, I feel like mental health is, again, one of those topics that's becoming more and more spoken about. It's still very, very vast. Like even to say mental health, that's a huge topic. I would love for people to get, like I said earlier, a feeling of complicity or not being so alone, and also to see a character that suffers from a mental illness, specifically bipolar, that is not a caricature, that is a real person that has a great intelligence and compassion and all those things. I think often we see those characters of people struggling that are depicted sort of in one color or one note, and it's like a lot of crazy acting. And so I hope that this shows a fully well-rounded person in a way to sort of destigmatize bipolar specifically, and ultimately inspire people to talk more about their own struggles, or whether that's directly their own issues or loved ones around them or friends or family around them.
Mhm. Thank you. Thank you, Miriam. It's been such a pleasure talking to you.
Likewise.
And I wish you good luck. I hope you have another film or another play in the
Yes.
work. And you do? Oh, great.
Yeah.
And we look forward to having you on the South African Film Festival screen again in the future. Thanks so much. Absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.